will get started. So, Rob, do you want to take us away?
Sure. We're really delighted to have you. One of the joys in our work has been that we work with very different kinds of schools that include the largest group of our schools are public schools, but we also work with an interesting set of what we call NAIS, National Association of Independent Schools, that are private schools that include boarding schools. We also have a significant set of Christian schools. It's just such an interesting range of folks, and it's a range of folks that we're not sure often gets to spend much time with each other. So we're really delighted to have you all here. We're going to be talking with you about what we've seen in pre and post-COVID. And the two of us from the Wellington Initiative are Brendan. Brendan, say hi to the people.
Hello.
Brendan is our director of client success, and I'm the chief engagement officer. And the Wellington Initiative is an organization created by the school I used to run, the Wellington School, that seeks to collect data from schools and try to give teachers and administrators the ability, better data about what really counts in education, with the hope of transforming education in the United. We want to save America is really what we're up to, but we're a not-for-profit owned by the Wellington School, with the purpose of trying to help schools to be the best they can be by looking specifically at engagement. So what we're going to do today is we're going to pose a couple of questions for you. We're going to show some data, and then we're going to throw out some hypotheses and the glorious thing about hypotheses is we don't have to have data that supports them. It's a hypothesis, and we're going to ask you for your reaction to those hypotheses. So I'm going to hand this over to Brendan to start talking about our analysis. And anytime you have a question, we'd like you to jump in and ask it. And there are a couple of points where we're going to be asking you to give us your feedback. Okay?
Sure. So a few months ago, we're looking at data and we're thinking, and it occurred to us that we had a pretty interesting opportunity to look at the difference in student engagement in schools before COVID hit, and then in the fall after, once we've had some time to adapt and try to figure out how we were going to do school going forward. So we wanted to get together data for, first, schools that had done dots in both the fall of 2019 and 2020, and then try to analyze just the differences between those two sets of data. So in essence, we're looking at what was the effect on student engagement of changes in schools due to COVID-19. And then we restrict that to only the handful of schools that had done dots in both the fall before COVID hit, so the fall of 2019, and then this past fall, so the fall of 2020. So what we are looking at is essentially just the raw difference in engagement between these two groups. What's important to note is that one of the things we're not able to look at is what specifically changed to cause these differences in engagement. It's interesting that, as Rob said earlier, there are a million different ways that schools have responded to the crisis. And so when we're thinking about what has changed in schools, that can be everything from a setting being in person or having school remotely. It can be scheduling. We've seen some schools have half of the student body come in on Monday and Tuesday and the other half come in on Thursday and Friday. Different safety precautions like students wearing masks or having plexiglass barriers put up, or even things like the availability of lunches for students who might not be able to get food otherwise if they're not in school. So there's a million different things that have changed in schools all over the country, and we're not able to control for everything. But what we were interested in doing was looking at that difference from fall 2019 to fall 2020 and seeing if there's anything we could glean from the results.
I also would just mention that as we look at this past fall's data, there are two things. One is a loosening and one is a tightening. When we compare this fall to last fall, the regulations, all sorts of issues have tightened the way schools work because you have to control for the distance between students and all of that sort of stuff. So there's all of this tightening that happened between last fall and the fall of 19 and the fall of 20. On the other hand, there's also a loosening because we're taking data from students who had been in March and April of 2020 entirely shut out of their schools. So in a certain way, what we're looking at when we look at the fall of 2020 are students who have been, who are looser, they've returned to school after being shut out. So we just want to keep in mind that when we look at that 2020 fall, there are two things happening. One is it's more restrictive than it was the previous fall, but it's also far more open than it was the previous spring.
Great point. So we'll now look at our sample of schools. So this is the schools that we're looking at that had a significant number of dots in both the fall of 2019 and the fall of 2020. And we don't want to talk about what specific schools those were just for privacy, but we can say that we have 9 schools that were public, 6 that were independent schools or members of NAIS, and then 4 schools that are members of ACSI, so Christian Protestant schools. And those schools are spread across 10 different states. We can look at the percentage of dots that fall in each of our quadrants. So about 26% were independent, 22% in that Christian ACSI group, and then 51% in public schools. And then that shifted in 2020 to still being about 50% in public schools, but a bit more independent schools than ACSI schools. And then to sort of further understand what we're looking at, we have it broken down by grade level as well. So we can see that about 60% of the dots we're looking at will be middle school dots, about 1/3 in the high school, and then about 2% in the lower school.
And we're happy to send this deck to you later on because we're throwing a lot of stuff at you. So if you'd like a copy of the deck, we're happy to send that to you. So we're going to get started. And again, we're going to start with a question or two, then we're going to show some data, and then we're going to throw out a hypothesis. And when we ask the question, we're asking you the question. So you get participation points that go towards your certificate of having attended, of which we're not providing one. So, here we go. Our first question is, in the fall of 2020, this past fall, do you think that student engagement increased, decreased, or stayed about the same? And for this answer, if you would pop it into your chat, I think that would be the best way to take an answer. A, and you can just say A, B, or C. Increased, student engagement increased, decreased, or stayed the same. B, I've got a couple of Bs. Oh, this looks like a very steady B. All right, so, and Craig came up with an A. Anybody else?
But Craig doesn't seem very sure if we look down at the video.
And Peter went with a C. Okay, so let's take a look at our classic donut here. And what we see is that there was a slight increase in engagement in the fall. So Craig gets full credit, and Peter can get some credit for saying the same because it's not a huge change, but we do see it as given the size of the sample, which is really quite a large sample, we do see it as a significant movement. And essentially what we saw is essentially 2.25% increase in the engaged quadrant, with most of that coming from the grind quadrant. So that ultimately is the picture. So slight increase in engagement, and pretty soon we're going to ask you why you think you were wrong. So Brendan, you want to take us through this data,
sure.
Please?
So then we were going to look at the quadrants and see their trends over that fall term to see if there was anything we could glean from that. So what we're looking at here is a teal line that represents the engaged percentage in the 2019 school year from September to December. And then in the 2020 school year, the same line, but with that dark blue. So what we can see here is that the two percentages were fairly close in September and October, but then we see a pretty big shift where engagement goes up about 5 points or so in November and stays higher than 2019 in December as well. So moving on, we can look at all of our other quadrants. So we see here pretty strong separation where the grind percentage, so our high challenge, low love it, is lower in 2020 for the entirety of that fall term. It doesn't matter the month pretty much, it's just always lower, and it gets even lower as time goes on. In board, we see it hop around a little bit before really separating, where we have lower board percentage in the 2020 fall. And then in the entertained area, we have a little bit of jumping around where the 2020 stays higher for most months, but not all of the months.
So before we move on, questions and comments about that data.
All right.
Okay, if there are no questions or comments today, we'll be done by 4:18. So we have two. We've put here two hypotheses here for your consideration, and we'd love your comments. The first one is students miss being in school. So this would be part of that loosening up, not the tightening, right? It's not that this fall was tighter than last fall. It's that this fall is looser than last spring. Students miss school and have an appreciation for school, which has caused them to be more engaged. That's our first hypothesis. Our second hypothesis is that unpredictability isn't necessarily an entirely bad thing. And that from this perspective, as we think about the job of students, it's pretty much the same job from the time they enter pre-K through 12, and to have a period where things are less predictable might well be an enhancement for engagement. And so what we'd love to do is, does anybody buy either of those? Anybody think, or anyone reject either of those or both of those?
I definitely think students missed being in school. And I know at our school, teachers were more intentional about relationship building as a curricular goal than they had been before the pandemic. So.
And why was that the case?
Well, last spring, we had a totally asynchronous model in terms of what was required of students for a whole host of reasons. But we were able to do that in the spring because we felt like, okay, so much is up in the air, so much is uncertain. We can kind of coast on the relationships that we've already spent 6 months building. And teachers were accessible for opt-in synchronous engagement. Office hours could be synchronous. There was basically, it was like, you can have as much synchronous time with your teachers as you want, but you don't have to have really any. Because our students are all over the world, and between time zones and tech equity issues, we just didn't think it was fair. By the fall, we figured out like, oh yeah, Zoom does work pretty reliably in pretty much every country. And then we didn't know that, we had a bunch of new kids coming in who were going to be learning at a distance. The kids who were here on campus were thrilled to be back together. But even the kids who were at a distance, I think, were more engaged because we had been more intentional about that relationship building. We also knew coming into the school year that, like, we were laying bets on whether we'd still be on campus by October. So we were like, better build relationships fast because the kids might leave again.
And that points to our second hypothesis here, which is, if you think that any day may be your last, do you value that day in a different kind of way? And we'd love to hear from, thank you, Gwyneth. Other comments on this?
I think from what we've seen throughout this year's pilot group with our East programs, unpredictability has always been part of our makeup. That's just kind of how we operate. And what we're seeing in East versus Gen Ed classes generally being a higher level of engagement, I think, unpredictability is a big part of that plays into that. Because then it's fresh every day. You never know. You never know.
You never know. You never know.
I'd like to comment on both those, if I may.
And when people talk, would you just a brief word about, just give your name is there, but just where you are. And
Peter Hersberg, calling from Stamford, Connecticut, New York City area. I thought both your comments, I'll start with Gwyneth. I think this intentional building of relationships, if engagement, if we know that engagement is often a product of building intense and deliberate relationships with kids, right? And we know we had to do that in a hybrid or online environment, or even in an environment where there was a lot of anxiety, right? Then that would help to explain that. And also if unpredictability also means variety, right? If it's a little synonymous for variety, not just like, oops, I didn't know that was going to happen. then teachers had to really design a kind of asynchronous variety in their work, right? That might have told some kids that, wow, this is interesting that I can do this I couldn't do before, you know? And so I think if you put those two comments together, I think there's a good deal. But I would like to know, you know, so much depends upon the school and the programs they had, which we don't know in this data, right? In terms of how you extrapolate one over the other. And also the fact that certain kinds of schools responded, you know? So that there's that element, but still, I think there's some good hypothetical stuff here.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Any other comments? Okay, well, I think, and one of the things I'd say about that this made me think of was that as a school administrator, I was never particularly fond of unpredictability. That part of running schools is that if they're predictable, you're going to have fewer issues. But it does remind me that for students, they are tasked to do the same kind of work kind of every day of their lives for a very long time. So an interesting difference in terms of perspective. We're going to take a look now at a somewhat different issue. And Brendan, do you want to pick up here?
Yeah, so next we're going to look at the difference in discipline areas, so math, science, language arts, world language, that we see between 2019 and 2020. And before we look at that, we're again just curious to know if there's any predictions on what you think the differences would look like and why you think those would be. So why a certain discipline might be more or less engaging in 2019 compared to 2020 or vice versa. Open floor for a minute or in the chat.
Why don't we in the chat, if you think there's a discipline that would be more impacted, why don't you offer that up? It's a hard question, I think.
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay, we have
Again, math might be higher, science and art.
Okay, so we have math, science, and art would be, okay, the question was that they would be more impacted. Okay, math and writing, foreign languages.
All right.
So we're a little bit all over the board on this, I think.
Well, let's plow into it then.
Okay.
So if we look at, and we're looking at disciplines that have at least 1,000 dots. So we had a few that had, 500 or 600 dots in them. So we eliminated those, but we're looking at just these disciplines. And it's interesting to note that we see math, science, and social studies have higher Lovett and challenge scores in 2020 than in 2019. But we see world language having higher Lovett but lower challenge. We see language arts with a higher challenge score in 2020, but about the same level of Lovett. And then at the bottom, we have arts and PE. So sort of interesting combinations where we see math, science, and social studies having sort of the same-ish movement, and then world language and language arts having their own sort of unique sets. So I don't know, any questions or thoughts on that before we share our hypothesis?
Just that math makes perfect sense to me.
Why?
Because,
Why would it be more challenging and kids would love it more?
Because if you're going to do math well in the setting that we've been in the last year, you have to find a way to differentiate more in good ways. And that doesn't, and math classes sometimes have a hard time doing that in class.
So Peter, would you be suggesting the possibility that if differentiation is more particular to the discipline, then you're likely to see an increase in engagement?
Maybe. In that discipline, yes, especially.
Okay.
Well, they say this is more due to the individualization per student, because teachers have really had to figure out, how do I reach that kid? Not all of them, that one.
That's right. And when you're in a class, you could just either forget about them unless you're really a good teacher, right? Who never does, or you could just assume they'll learn from the others and be pulled along.
Okay, other thoughts? Well, we're gonna put our hypothesis up here. I must say I'm not sure we have that much confidence in this, what we saw was that for that the courses that are more defined by particular content seemed to be higher in Challenge and Love It in this past fall, to move in that direction more so than those that were more process based. So, and our thought was that if you're teaching an Algebra 1 or a Spanish 2 or a biology, you're going to be more dependent on content issues than you are in language arts or English, where you might read pretty much anything. In an art class, or in what's our other one, Brendan, in that group?
Well, let's just take a look. So we had arts, language arts, and world language that were lower, or different, I should say, than the math, science, social studies group.
So we feel comfortable that we found a correlation, but we're not confident that the hypothesis is the reason that this is what's happening. And it was interesting, Peter, when you jumped on math as one of those where it ought to be, that you were seeing a different thing. So thoughts? The stronger the content demand, the better in this post-COVID or this COVID fall.
Jerry from Little Rock. Is it that content provides some level of continuity to where process, if I'm just thinking about something, I can go in 47 different directions, but content, whether it's a book or an outline or something, I just wonder, does that provide enough direction to keep?
Does that provide structure in a year when there's not much structure?
Right. And processing seems like it could be a little more challenging because I go deep down this hole and it ends up being there doesn't seem to be enough of a safety net or parameters to kind of help me focus on where I might need to go.
Yeah, I like that. Other thoughts?
Jerry, going back to what you said, maybe it's a process-oriented thing. What I really like to do is find some other people to work with to help me through the process. And if the content of the online or the hybrid program doesn't do that, if it's not built that way as much, if it's much more individualistic, let's say. So I think a lot depends upon how it was structured.
Okay, great. Thank you. Any other comments? The other one we looked at, which we didn't mention there, is physical education, where we heard that there was dramatically different practices this year in some schools than in other years, where there was no huddling up and all sorts of restrictions on movements of students, and yet that was the place where there was the smallest change, almost no change at all in terms of engagement. So we thought that was kind of interesting too. All right, Brendan, let's move on to our next piece.
Sure. So now we're going to look at the changes that occurred between 2019 and 2020 fall terms, but looking at it from the view of student gender. So we're trying to see if there were similar movements or different movements between particularly male and female. While our data has male and female, and then we have this undetermined other or unknown, which could be non-binary or some other classification, because most of the data was in that male and female area, we're going to pretty much just look at male and female for the purpose of this analysis. So we're about half and half with male and female in both 2019 and 2020.
That the majority of the undetermined, unknown, other came from schools that simply did not upload any data in terms of gender.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Right.
So it's just, we're not sure. So our first question would simply be, which gender, if any of them, do we think would be most impacted in the fall of 2020? Would male have a greater movement? Would female have a greater movement? What do you think that would be? And if you could put that in the chat, that'd be great. Boys would have a greater movement. Okay, interesting. All right. Well,
Well, we can't let Gwyneth be the only one to respond to this. Any other thoughts? Movement positively or negatively, great question. I think we just go with movement. Different.
more individual, no significance. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, let's give it a look. So we're looking at just our quadrants here. So we can see that from 2019 to 2020, female students tended to have a larger increase in engagement than male students from 2019 to 2020. They both improved, but female students seem to have a larger jump. And that movement was, I think, a bit more from the board quadrant than for male, though it might not be that significant. So it's interesting to note that while there was an increase for both male and female students, it was much more for the female students.
And we had Stan and Craig who predicted that, and I'm wondering if either of you would like to tell us a little bit more what you were thinking.
Stan, if you could unmute, love to hear from you.
I thought I had done that. You hear me now?
Yes, sir.
All right. I just, in North Little Rock, Arkansas, I found the girls are more able to adapt than the boys were. Think on their feet, make changes for what we're doing. I just felt they were able to move faster because they felt more confident.
Okay, great. Craig, did you have a similar thought or an opposite thought?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. A little bit different, not opposite, but at least in Winton Woods schools, I would say the girls are more likely to be self-starters and work on their own than the boys. So I could anticipate that.
Okay, great.
Interesting.
Good. Okay, so our hypothesis, we had actually, to start with, was that lockdown was tougher for female students. Conventional wisdom tells us that they are more collaborative in nature, and so that was one of our thoughts. I like what Stan and Craig said better. Other thoughts?
I don't think that's a bad hypothesis at all, though, because for students who kind of crave a system in place, then the engagement of school, no matter whether it's hybrid or blended hybrid virtual, whatever version, the engagement is going to satisfy that need.
I wonder, is that social element, where to go with that? Because students are so, for the most part, engaged online. So I don't, yeah.
Yeah. So interesting, and yeah, Craig, thanks so much, and Stan and Jerry, thank you for your feedback. Did we hear only from men on this question? So we just had a session of mansplaining, and we're wondering if there are any other perspectives that anyone would like to share.
Well, I think I'm still processing the idea that engagement got greater. You know, it's like when I said that I thought there would be a bigger impact on boys, I was thinking it would be more of a negative.
Oh, okay. Uh-huh.
And I'm thinking about how.
So May, just for clarification, so relatively, girls were going to do better.
Yeah. Right.
Which is what seems to be the consensus from the men anyway. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And one thing I'm thinking about is just the pressure that girls put on themselves to be perfect in every context. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, so the idea that lockdown was tougher on female students, like tougher could mean a lot of things. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, girls probably threw themselves into the task of figuring out online school more like readily than boys did.
Mm.
In my own experience, the boys were more likely to be like sort of external locus of control, like,
Mhm.
well, this is bad and this is hard and I'm mad about it. So
Uh-huh.
I will express that by not doing my work. Like, so yeah, I think like that engagement in school from the girls is not mutually exclusive with lockdown being really tough on them.
Right. Right. Okay, great. Any other thoughts? Thank you, Gwyneth. Well, Rinda's asked a really interesting question here. Any
Yeah.
difference seen by grade range?
Yeah, Rinda's shooting way too quickly, way too far ahead.
So we're really kind of interested in two questions here. One is this question that I think are students in all age groups affected the same way? And the way we're looking at age groups in this is we're going to look at three different age groups. We're going to look at third and fourth graders. We don't have a sample below third grade that we think is really meaningful. We're going to look at what we're calling middle school, which is 5th through 8th grade, and then high school, upper school, 9th through 12th grade. So the first question we're asking, do you think that students in all three of those age groups are affected the same? And we'll take on your chats, please, if you'd let us know. No, not the same. No. We've got a national no on this. So not a chance, says Greg. Okay. And then our second question is, as we look at each of these three groups, are male and female students in each affected the same way? So would we see the same direction for boys and girls within each of those groups? And if you gave a no, we're now in a new question, so we're ready for more chats.
I think those are for the next one. I think we had some
okay.
no's. Yeah.
Oh, we already had some no's. Okay,
Yeah.
all right. Well, Brendan, I don't suppose you have a fascinating graph on this.
So this is a fascinating graph on the topic. So there's kind of a lot to look at here. So we can take a minute or two just to go through it slowly. So we're looking at the student gender by division by school year. So each one of these graphs is a different division. So we have grades 3 through 4, grades 5 through 8, and then grades 9 through 12. And they're all scaled the same. So this is from 30 to 60, just like this one, and they're all from 0 to 60. So we're all on the same scale.
And the first thing that I just point out is that as they rise higher on the page, that's the level of challenge increasing as time goes on. So.
Exactly. So in the teal points are the 2019 school year as before, and the dark blue points are the 2020 school year as before. So what we see here is sort of two trends happening at the same time. For the lower grades, grades 3 and 4, we see that both male and female students have lower Lovett and lower challenge in 2020 than in 2019. In 5th through 8th grade, they have higher Lovett but lower challenge. So instead of moving down to the left, they move down to the right. And then in 9 through 12, they both have higher Lovett and higher challenge. So they're both up and to the right. So we have the simultaneous movement for male and female students in each division from year to year, which is really interesting. But then at the same time, we also have a shift where in the lower grades, we have a bigger change for male students than for female students. So male students moved, quite far, while female students had a very small movement. In grades 5 and 8, the movement's about the same. Male and female students had about the same movement down and to the right. And then it's slight, but in 9th and 12th grade, female students had a bit of a larger movement up and to the right than the male students. So our two trends are this down to the left, down to the right, up to the right, kind of going around the clock. And then the magnitude of the movements where we have larger movement for male students, about the same for male and female, and then a bit larger for female students. So any questions or anything on that? I think this graph is amazing, but it takes a little while to understand, I think.
Can you explain the 3-4 for me a little bit? I'm not, for some reason I'm having trouble reading that as much as the other.
Sure. So we've just grouped each of these by grade levels.
Right.
So here,
Yeah.
this is grades 3 and grades 4. And then
Yeah.
here is like middle school, 5 through 8, and then high school, 9 through
Yeah,
12.
I just wanted the 3-4 to be explained to me a little more.
Sure. So we're just looking at the movement from the 2019 to 2020 school year.
Mhm.
So here we have male students in 2019 were about here, and then they've moved down to here in 2020.
Gotcha.
Whereas female students only moved from that point to that point. So much
So,
smaller movement.
so
I
both
was being
move,
dyslexic. I was reading backwards, reading in
Yeah.
Hebrew.
both move to lower Lovett and lower challenge, but the boys move a whole lot more than the girls.
Mhm. Gotcha. Thank you.
Thoughts?
Question mobility. Because the elementary grades, for the most part, you're in one classroom all day long for the majority of the time. Does that account for the movement down and to the left? Those middle school grades, you're moving a little bit more, changing classes a little bit more, not necessarily a whole lot though yet. But then in the upper grades, of course, then you've got that class switch and variety. And I'm just curious if this kind of plays along with that.
So your hypothesis might be that the more students get to move, the more engaged they would be, which is, we often talk about that, and that COVID would have impact on that, in that it would really make the youngest kids move less as they're sitting between their plexiglass.
Yeah, I think the idea being that for these students right here, they're used to moving a lot and now they don't get to as much.
Mhm.
And then here you move a little bit and you can move a little more. And then here you don't move at all because you're in front of a computer or whatever. Or no, you move a lot. And then I guess you continue to move, but in person, I don't know.
I think it has to do with social learning too. I think elementary school kids, I work with elementary school kids a lot in my new job in a way that I didn't before, another job. And they're, we're used to thinking of middle school kids as social learners, and maybe we think of high school kids as a little combination of social and more independent. But elementary school kids are really social learners. I mean, they need each other to learn. And you can't disaggregate the social emotional learning from the cognitive learning at all in elementary school. And for them to be in front of a screen or in a hybrid situation, it's just not optimal. And the lower the grade goes, the less successful it's been. And almost anyone you talk to will say that. Work with kids. So that is not surprising to me whatsoever. Having said that, schools are getting better at it. Over time, you'd probably see that change a little bit. But, for those little kids, there's no substitute for being in the playground.
Okay. Other thoughts? And Peter, your little kids aren't in the playground?
They're in school every day. We've been live every day, and school is a playground for them in a way.
Okay.
As I wish it were for high school kids too.
Okay. Other thoughts? Thank you, Peter.
All right, why don't we put up our hypothesis, Rob?
Okay.
There you go.
This is our most complicated hypothesis.
It's a two-parter.
It's a two-parter. And the first notion here, or as COVID required students to have greater autonomy, we think. Less direction from teachers and more, and some of you talked when you were talking about the difference between boys and girls, more self-starting. And that in part, as students get older, they have a greater desire for and the ability to utilize autonomy. So the notion is that in lower school, they don't want autonomy and they can't use autonomy. And that particularly boys need more external control than girls, which is why when we move to whatever this COVID looks like in the lower school, one over there, yeah. Boys move more negatively than girls. And they move down into the left, less Lovett, less challenge. For 5th and 8th graders, we are surmising that students actually want autonomy, but don't know what to do with it. And that the notion being there that we would see higher Lovett and lower challenge, and that high schoolers actually want autonomy and are about ready to deal with it. So that we would see if there's more autonomy in the COVID world, and I'm not sure that's the case, that we see both boys and girls or men and women moving up and to the right, more Lovett and more challenge. So that's our complicated hypothesis, and we'd love your reaction to that. Who thinks that's just really not true?
Is it hogwash?
Hogwash.
I think it's one of your strongest hypotheses.
Yeah, I buy it.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Brendan, we should end this right now.
I mean, what's interesting is it's one of your, I think the hypothesis is exactly right, even though kids of all ages are craving connection and collaboration.
Right.
The required autonomy this took to survive well is something they had to learn, and older kids were able to learn that better and more ready for it.
Okay. Any other comments on this? So that got a better reception, Brendan, than I was expecting. So I'm very pleased. This has been a win for me. So and Craig is agreeing with us as well. Oh, and Patrick. Oh, and okay. Thank you, everybody. So we just think this is a really interesting slide because it's so complicated, and in one way, the boys and girls all move in the same direction, but they really move at different lengths of time, so or different intensity in terms of their movement. Brendan, anything more you want to say about this one?
No, I think we've pretty much nailed it. I mean, it's just really interesting to see those two simultaneous movements, and so to try to find an interesting way to explain it with this autonomy piece is really interesting. So glad to hear that you all agree with Rob on that one.
Okay, so we want to talk just for a couple of minutes if we can, and I think we do have time for it. Brendan,
Yes.
you want to take us on?
Sure.
Here?
And this was part 2 of that, but I think Rob already included it in part 1. So we're good to go.
Yes, okay, good.
So then we wanted to look at differences in race or ethnic group and see if there was any difference in engagement around that. So we have all the different race ethnic groups in the data set as the US Census designations. And we can see the percentage of total dots that fell in each race ethnic group. For the purpose of the analysis, we're only going to look at groups that have more than 1% of the total dots in both sets. And that's purely because we're concerned that, you know, if we just have 5 to 10 to 20, say Native Hawaiian students in the sample, it might just be that they were more engaged in 9th grade than in 10th grade or vice versa. So we're not sure we can draw a lot from that. So when we look at the information, we're going to look at just the 2+ races, Asian students, Black or African American students, and then white students. So our question then is, would the changes due to COVID be the same for students of all race or ethnic groups? Doesn't matter if they're positive changes or negative changes, but do we think that everyone will see the same movement?
And we're looking in the chat box for this. Okay. We've got a no. Stan was the first. Absolutely not. Gwyneth sees Stan's no and raises it.
Depends on SES, okay.
Okay, yeah. No.
That would be really interesting, though we have spotty data on that.
Right. Oh, and Craig has seen, Craig, okay, yeah, woof, okay.
Royal
There's
flush
some,
there from Craig.
Yeah, there we go.
All right, so let's just hop into the data then. So this is student race ethnic group by year, where again, the teal dot is 2019 and the blue dot is 2020. So we see small difference for Asian students and for white students, a bit of a movement for 2+ races, but mainly we see a large movement for Black or African American students in the really positive direction. So we have much higher Lovett score and much higher challenge score that really closes some of the gap really between students of other race ethnic groups. Any questions or comments on that?
Thoughts?
Thoughts? Ideas?
I definitely thought it was going to go in the other direction. Again,
Say more, Gwyneth. Say more about that.
well, I think, and of course, I'm just looking at it through the lens of our own model, which, as you said, like no two schools have been handling this
Right.
alike. And so I think there's part of me that's assuming that every other school on the planet, like I'm having a hard time filtering through my brain, like how many of these schools were entirely in person? How many of these schools
Right.
were like I keep forgetting that the COVID experience in public and day schools is really, really different in the classroom. Whereas our classroom experience, with the exception of like certain like classroom capacity limits and things like that, like those things are different, but the overall experience is probably like 85% normal. So I'm thinking like, I think I'm thinking through the lens of the spring instead of either fall. And so I know that for our, for many of our students of color, for whom there's a pretty high correlation of lower socioeconomic status, it was harder to navigate distance learning than it was for our wealthier, whiter students who had access to their own room, really strong Wi-Fi. They, you know, they could go to their parents' office and use all the office equipment because their parents owned the company. You know, it's like, so my predictions are just based on bad assumptions.
But Gwyneth, are you saying at your school then? I mean, your assumptions, may not be based on survey data, but in terms of what you saw, are you saying doesn't correlate to what you're seeing on this graph?
Well, I think it sort of depends which model this is reflecting. Like if this is in-person learning, then yeah, this makes sense to me. If this is remote or hybrid learning, then I'm surprised.
So do we know that from this model? This is all kinds of learning. It doesn't really matter. It's just learning during COVID, whether a school is open or not.
Exactly. This is a million different ways that schools have tweaked or changed things. So that's why it's difficult to really say, oh, this is because of blended learning.
And not only is every school different, but the experience within every school has, in many schools, has been very different. So really, we can't correlate the kind of learning each student was doing at that moment with this data. So, which calls into question how we interpret all of this. So, yeah.
Yeah, this is a tough one because.
Other comments about this? Okay, well, we're gonna throw in our hypothesis because we think we ought to have one. And this one's a lot simpler than the last one. And one of the things we think is really important in all of this work is to think about how good the status quo was that we left behind. And is it possible, in fact, that that the status quo, the previous status quo, depressed, for whatever reason, student engagement for Black and African American students? And that whatever change had a good chance of positively impacting that group more than others. And we'd love to take your comments.
Thinking individualized learning helps with engagement overall. Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Other thoughts, especially, okay. Thank you. Other folks, any thoughts about that? Craig, I'm always used to your having a very strong reaction.
More deliberate formation of relationships with remote learning. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Other thoughts? Well, we're going to give you what we think are 3 takeaways. And of course, we wrote these takeaways before we started, so we might have different takeaways now, but we're going to provide you with the takeaway. Gwyneth has a comment here for us. How much asynchronous learning has enabled teachers to look more at what and less at who of student works mitigating the impact of implicit bias. That's a great comment, Gwyneth. Thank you. So
Yeah.
we wrote 3 takeaways, which may all be moot at this point, or may be heightened by prescience. So first, we think that one of the things that's worth thinking about is we've had a long time of schools doing the same stuff the same way for a long time. And we just think that if, COVID's a bad and terrible thing. Thank you, Stan. And, but maybe it might give a gift or two. And one of our gifts might be to remind us that disruption isn't always a terrible thing. And I don't mean that in terms of people's health. I just mean that in terms of rhythms of the way kids work. So that's our first, is that maybe we should be planning more disruption from time to time when nature doesn't provide it for us. Our second takeaway is it time that schools who haven't seriously think about how they work the whole notion of student autonomy into curriculum from the day students enter schools to the day they leave. And if you've seen thank you, Gwyneth, if you've seen our beautiful TED Talk, we talk about autonomy as being one of what we think are the 3 great drivers in autonomy. And then, and Brendan wants me to move on to the third one. So, and then just a recollection that the pre-COVID status might not have been good for everyone, and it may inspire us to take do some significant thinking about the fact that prior to COVID was not the golden day for education, and there are all sorts of reasons for that being the case, including high stakes standardized testing or implicit bias or any number of other things. So we thought that those were 3 significant takeaways. I'm not sure that they have been undercut during this conversation, and would love any final comments that people would like to make. We have about 3 minutes, and we are absolutely determined to end this at 5 o'clock. So any other thoughts, any closing thoughts?
Looking at all of the data, it appears like years later when someone else stumbles across this, would they be able to say, wow, something happened here?
Yeah.
Is it that evident?
Is that a rhetorical question?
Well, no, I'm curious. Yeah, there have been something, but I mean, we didn't look at 2018 and we don't have next year's data. And I'm just curious, is this going to be a major bump, or is this just going to kind of blend in with typical?
Or will schools return to exactly what they were doing before?
Exactly.
As soon as everyone's vaccinated? Yeah.
I'm just curious I know the data may not support it now, but I'm curious later on, would an untrained eye be able to look at the last 18 months and go, wow, we got it. What happened here? I don't know.
Well, from an engagement standpoint, we're hoping you'll all stick with us for another 10 years, and
So
we'll be able to find that out. It's a great question, Jerry. Thank you. Other comments or questions? Well, we're right about at our time. We want to thank you so much for joining us for what we thought. Brendan?
Gwyneth has a question.
Oh, Gwyneth. I'm sorry, Gwyneth.
Comment. I'm so into this idea of scope and sequencing autonomy. I'm like, if people want to keep talking about this later, I want to go scope and sequence autonomy right now. So if other people are feeling the same way and would like to continue that conversation at some point.
I would. Our whole school is based upon that philosophy. I'm not sure we do it well, but I'd love to talk with you about it.
Awesome. I'd love that.
And the thing I'd love to do is to talk to the Ohio legislature and the Arkansas legislature and the North Dakota legislature and every place we're working about that as an issue. The work that EAST does, for instance, you've heard of EAST in Arkansas, is a program that I think is really centered around autonomy. Building autonomy in kids. So if I have the choice of embracing high stakes standardized testing or student autonomy, I'm going with student autonomy.
And that and agency, the connection between autonomy and agency.
Yeah. Other thoughts before we say goodbye? It's now 5 o'clock our time and some other time for some of you.
I do have one quick question for you guys. Has COVID caused you to try to come up with a third or another dimension? You've got this wonderful rubric. Has there been another is there something that you can go 3D and go this way as well? I mean, has there been anything else that has kind of risen as far as measurement of like, this is something maybe we can consider?
When we started this 6 years ago, we had a third dimension. I can't remember what it was though, and it dropped out. I don't know that COVID has done that for us, but I think we continue to ask the question of if essentially the greatest thing we can do for kids, aside from teach them some stuff, is to leave them hungry for more, and that we do that by challenging them and having them love the work that they find challenging. It seems to me that the quadrant holds up. I'm not sure that changes. How you get there may change. Other thoughts?
Well,
Question on attendance.
I'm sorry?
I've got to run to a meeting. Thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate
Great.
it.
And Brendan and I will hang out for another 5 or 10, but thank you so much. And we can stop recording, and we hope this has been useful. We are available at any time should you have any interest in pursuing any of this with us or anything else. And we're thankful that you work with us. It has enriched our lives to get to know you all, and I hope we've been of some help to you as well. So thanks so much.